Imagine a time when the turmoil in your mind wasn't seen as illness but as something far more sinister. Whispers of demonic possession, the icy grip of unseen forces, and a world where suffering was a terrifying spectacle. Before science shed light, this was reality. What demons do you wrestle with in the quiet of the night? Speaking of night, or perhaps day, where are you joining us from on this journey into the past? And what hour does the clock show in your corner of the world? Let us know. Hey guys, welcome. We're diving into how demons were once blamed for mental illness. Like and subscribe, then dim the lights and get comfy. Let's begin. Welcome back. As we settle deeper into our exploration of how humanity has understood the troubled mind, our journey now takes us far back, to the very dawn of civilization. In these ancient worlds, long before clinical terms or scientific instruments, the concept of mental illness as we know it simply didn't exist. Instead, profound mental distress, erratic behavior, or deep, inconsolable sadness were often viewed through a very different lens. A lens that magnified the power of the unseen, the divine, and the spectral. The line between a troubled soul and a divinely touched or demonically tormented one was perilously thin, often indistinguishable. In many ancient cultures, from Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley, the gods, or a singular divine entity, were not distant, abstract beings. They were intimately involved in human affairs, capable of bestowing great blessings, but also of inflicting terrible suffering as punishment for perceived transgressions, impiety, or the breaking of sacred taboos. Unexplained mental anguish or aberrant behavior could therefore be interpreted as a direct sign of divine wrath. Conversely, in some instances, particularly those involving visions or ecstatic states, an individual might be considered God-touched or divinely inspired, a vessel for prophecy, albeit one whose earthly experience was often deeply unsettling and isolating. Beyond the direct intervention of gods, a pervasive belief across numerous ancient societies was in the power of spirits, both benevolent and malevolent. The air itself was thought to teem with these entities. Spirits of ancestors, nature spirits, or malevolent demons and ghosts, all capable of influencing human thoughts, emotions, and actions. If someone experienced what we might now recognize as a psychotic episode, severe depression, or debilitating anxiety, it was commonly attributed to the malevolent influence of an evil spirit that had invaded or attached itself to the individual, or perhaps the result of a curse enacted through such an entity. However, even in these ancient times, the seeds of a different kind of understanding were being sown, one that looked for causes within the individual rather than solely from external supernatural forces. Among the earliest attempts to explain health and illness, including mental states, through a more naturalistic framework, was the theory of humoralism, which would later be most famously codified by the ancient Greek physician Hippocrates around the 4th century BCE. This wasn't a sudden shift, but a gradual emergence of thought that sought physical explanations for all ailments. The humoral theory proposed that the human body contained 4 essential fluids, or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humor was associated with a particular quality: hot, cold, moist, dry, and often with a specific temperament or personality type. A healthy individual was one in whom these 4 humors were in perfect balance. Illness, whether physical or mental, was believed to arise when this delicate equilibrium was disturbed, when one humor became deficient, or more commonly, excessive. This was a significant step, moving the locus of the problem, at least partially, from the heavens or the spirit world to the internal environment of the body. For instance, an excess of black bile, associated with the element of earth and the qualities of cold and dry, was widely believed to be the cause of melancholia, a condition characterized by prolonged sadness, despondency, and lethargy, sharing many features with what we now call depression. Treatments, therefore, aimed to restore humoral balance. This might involve dietary changes, specific herbal remedies, or more invasive procedures like purging, vomiting, or bloodletting, all designed to expel the supposed excess of the problematic humor and coax the body back to its natural state of equilibrium. Another fascinating and, to our modern understanding, entirely erroneous, yet historically significant concept, particularly in ancient Egyptian and Greek medicine, was that of the wandering womb, or hysteria. This theory, exclusively applied to women, posited that the uterus, hystera in Greek, was an independent, animal-like organ that could become dislodged and move throughout the woman's body. If it traveled upwards, it was thought to cause a variety of physical and emotional symptoms, including suffocation, anxiety, fainting spells, and what was described as erratic emotional behavior. The prescribed treatments often aim to lure the womb back to its proper place using pleasant or foul odors. Thus, the ancient world presents us with a complex tapestry of beliefs, On the one hand, powerful supernatural explanations dominated the understanding of mental suffering, attributing it to the will of gods, the mischief of spirits, or the dark magic of curses. These beliefs fostered fear and often led to rituals, exorcisms, or social ostracization. On the other hand, thinkers like Hippocrates and the proponents of Humoralism were beginning to lay the groundwork for a more naturalistic, body-centered understanding of illness. These early medical theories, while rudimentary and often incorrect by today's standards, represented a crucial intellectual shift, suggesting that not all suffering was a direct consequence of supernatural intervention, but could arise from internal, physical imbalances, capable, at least in theory, of being treated through physical means. This uneasy coexistence of the sacred, the spectral, and the somatic would continue to shape perceptions of mental illness for centuries to come. As the structures of the ancient world crumbled and Europe entered the period broadly known as the Middle Ages, roughly spanning from the 5th to the 15th century, the understanding of mental affliction underwent a profound and often terrifying transformation. The diverse, if sometimes rudimentary, naturalistic explanations explored by Greek and Roman physicians largely receded into the shadows, overshadowed by a worldview increasingly dominated by the doctrines and authority of the Christian Church. In this era, the veil between the physical and spiritual worlds was perceived as extraordinarily thin, and the workings of the human mind, particularly when disturbed, became a battleground for celestial and infernal forces. The theological framework of medieval Christianity provided a comprehensive lens through which all aspects of life, including suffering and illness, were interpreted. Central to this was the cosmic struggle between God and Satan, good and evil. Human beings were seen as vulnerable to the machinations of the devil and his legions of demons, who actively sought to corrupt souls and spread chaos. Within this paradigm, unusual or distressing mental states were frequently not seen as medical issues, but as direct evidence of demonic activity, either as a punishment for sin, a test of faith, or, most commonly, as outright demonic possession. Thus, the idea that mental illness was caused by demonic possession became the overwhelmingly dominant explanation across medieval Europe. What we might now diagnose as schizophrenia, epilepsy, bipolar disorder, dissociative identity disorder, or even severe depression or anxiety, was readily attributed to an evil spirit or spirits having invaded and taken control of an individual's body and mind. This wasn't just a fringe belief, it was a deeply embedded societal understanding, supported by religious texts, scholarly treatises, and the pronouncements of the Church, which held immense sway over both spiritual and temporal matters. The devil was not an abstract concept, but a very real and present adversary, constantly seeking to ensnare human souls. Any deviation from normative behavior, any intense emotional outburst, any profound withdrawal from society, or any inexplicable physical ailment could be construed as a sign of his nefarious influence. The human body and mind were considered permeable, susceptible to the assaults of these malevolent entities. Stories of demonic temptation, torment, and possession were widespread, fueling a pervasive fear and shaping the collective imagination of medieval society. The Church, as the principal spiritual authority, naturally assumed the leading role in confronting these perceived demonic threats. It was the clergy who were deemed equipped, through divine sanction, to diagnose and treat conditions attributed to supernatural causes. Learned theologians and humble parish priests alike engaged with the problem of disturbed minds, armed with scripture, religious rites, and a conviction in their power to combat the forces of darkness. This reinforced the Church's authority, as it positioned itself as the sole protector of the faithful against an ever-present spiritual enemy. Determining whether someone was truly possessed by a demon, bewitched, or merely suffering from a more ordinary, albeit still religiously framed, malady was a complex and often subjective process. There were no standardized diagnostic criteria in the modern sense. Clerics might look for signs such as speaking in unknown languages, xenoglosy, exhibiting unusual strength, expressing revulsion towards sacred objects like crucifixes or holy water, demonstrating knowledge of distant or hidden things, or uttering blasphemies. The interpretation of these signs, however, was highly dependent on the individual examiner's beliefs, biases, and the local cultural context. Once a diagnosis of demonic possession was made, the primary and often only prescribed remedy was the rite of exorcism. This was a solemn and often dramatic ritual conducted by an ordained priest aimed at expelling the invading demonic entity in the name of God. The exorcism would involve specific prayers, invocations, the reading of scripture, the sprinkling of holy water, the making of the sign of the cross, and sometimes the use of blessed salt or religious relics. The process could be lengthy, physically and emotionally draining for both the exorcist and the afflicted individual, and its success was far from guaranteed. Many symptoms that today would point towards neurological or psychiatric conditions were interpreted through this intensely religious filter. For instance, convulsive seizures, a hallmark of epilepsy, were almost universally seen as a physical manifestation of a demon writhing within the possessed person's body. Auditory or visual hallucinations were often considered to be the whispers or apparitions of demons. Manic episodes, with their high energy and sometimes grandiose or blasphemous speech, were clear evidence of diabolical influence, while periods of deep melancholy or mutism could be interpreted as the soul being oppressed or stolen by dark forces. The very language used to describe mental suffering was steeped in religious connotation. Individuals weren't ill in a secular medical sense. They were tormented, vexed, possessed, or lunatic, the latter term itself hinting at the moon's supposed influence, often tied to more ancient, lingering pagan beliefs that sometimes intermingled with Christian demonology. There was little room for nuance. Behavior was either godly or ungodly, sane or demonically inspired. This binary often left little hope for understanding or compassion in the modern sense. This overarching belief in demonic causation fostered a pervasive atmosphere of fear and superstition throughout medieval society. People lived with a constant awareness of the potential for supernatural attack. The mentally afflicted were often feared and shunned, seen not just as sufferers, but as potential conduits of evil, dangerous to the spiritual well-being of the community. This fear was further compounded by the overlapping belief in witchcraft, where individuals, often women, could be accused of willingly consorting with demons to gain malevolent powers, with mental instability sometimes being cited as evidence of such a pact. The fate of those deemed possessed or afflicted by demonic influence varied. Some, after undergoing exorcisms, were considered cleansed and might be reintegrated into society, though often carrying a lasting stigma. Others, for whom exorcisms proved ineffective, might endure prolonged suffering, be confined in rudimentary asylums or monastic cells, or be left to wander as outcasts. In the later Middle Ages, particularly as the witch hunts intensified from the 15th century onwards, individuals displaying signs of mental illness were at severe risk of being accused of witchcraft and subjected to interrogation, torture, and execution. The line between being a victim of demonic possession and a willing accomplice of the devil became dangerously blurred. While the demonic model was dominant, it would be an oversimplification to suggest that no other ideas existed, however marginalized. Some echoes of the classical humoral theories persisted in learned monastic texts, and folk medicine traditions often included herbal remedies or rituals that were not strictly exorcistic. However, these were largely overshadowed, and any explanations that directly contradicted church doctrine or downplayed the role of the supernatural were likely to be suppressed or ignored. The intellectual and social climate strongly favored spiritual interpretations over material ones. In essence, the Middle Ages forged a powerful and enduring link between madness and the diabolical. For centuries, the primary response to severe mental distress was not medical intervention in any recognizable modern form, but spiritual warfare. This period, characterized by the perceived reign of demons over the minds of men and women, left an indelible mark on Western consciousness, shaping attitudes towards mental illness in ways that would take many more centuries to begin to dismantle. The haunting image of the possessed individual writhing in the grip of an unseen evil became a potent symbol of the era's deepest anxieties. As the medieval period waned and Europe transitioned into the early modern era, roughly from the late 15th to the early 18th century, the prevailing fear of demonic influence did not diminish. Instead, it morphed and intensified, funneling into one of history's most tragic and brutal phenomena, the Great Witch Hunts. While the concept of demonic possession saw the afflicted as often unwilling victims, the rising obsession with witchcraft posited a far more sinister scenario. Individuals, it was believed, could willingly enter into pacts with the devil, trading their souls for malevolent powers to harm others and subvert Christian society. This chapter delves into that dark convergence, where the symptoms of what we now understand as mental illness were tragically and systematically misinterpreted as undeniable proof of witchcraft. The distinction between being possessed by a demon and being a witch was critical, and it carried dire consequences. A possessed person might elicit pity and attempts at spiritual rescue through exorcism. A witch, however, was deemed a heretic, a criminal, an enemy of God and humanity, who had consciously chosen evil. This shift in perception meant that individuals displaying unusual behaviors were no longer just seen as spiritually afflicted, but as active, malicious agents of Satan deserving of the severest punishment. The focus shifted from saving a tormented soul to eradicating a perceived threat. Fueling this escalating paranoia was the infamous treatise The Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, first published in 1487. Written by Heinrich Kramer and Jakob Springer, this book became a veritable guidebook for witch hunters, clergy, and magistrates. It meticulously detailed supposed witch behaviors, methods for their identification, interrogation, and prosecution. Crucially, many of the signs and proofs of witchcraft described within its pages, such as erratic speech, delusions of grandeur or persecution, claims of spectral encounters, or unusual physical contortions, were in reality often overt manifestations of severe mental distress, epilepsy, or other neurological conditions. The crime of witchcraft itself was a nebulous and dangerously flexible concept. It could encompass anything from causing a neighbor's cow to fall ill, to conjuring storms, to engaging in nocturnal flights and orgiastic rituals known as sabbats. Because the evidence was often based on hearsay, spectral testimony, claims by accusers that they were attacked by the accused spirit, or the highly subjective interpretation of misfortune, it became terrifyingly easy for accusations to take root, especially against those already on the margins of society or those exhibiting any form of abnormality. Consider the symptoms of hallucinations or delusions, common in conditions like schizophrenia or severe psychosis. An individual claiming to hear voices might be confessing, in the eyes of their interrogators, to communicating with demonic familiars. Vivid, terrifying visions could be twisted into accounts of attending witches' sabbats or engaging in infernal pacts. What was a deeply personal and bewildering experience of altered reality for the sufferer became, in the courtroom, irrefutable proof of their collusion with the devil and their participation in a vast, unseen conspiracy against Christendom. Similarly, erratic or unpredictable behavior, a hallmark of various mental health conditions, was readily interpreted as malevolence. Manic episodes characterized by boundless energy, rapid speech, and grandiose ideas could be seen as unnatural excitement fueled by demonic power. Deep melancholic withdrawal, mutism, or catatonic states could be interpreted as sullen defiance or the stupor induced by demonic possession as part of a witch's guise. Public outbursts, social inappropriateness, or simply a failure to conform to strict societal norms could all contribute to the deadly portrait of a witch. Overwhelmingly, those accused and convicted of witchcraft were women. Estimates vary, but scholars agree that somewhere between 75 to 85% of those executed during European witch hunts were female. This disproportionate targeting stemmed from a confluence of factors: deep-seated societal misogyny that often portrayed women as intellectually weaker, morally frailer, and more susceptible to demonic temptation, their roles as healers, herbalists, or midwives, which could easily be cast in a sinister light if misfortune struck, and their general lack of social and legal power to defend themselves effectively. The search for physical evidence on the accused body was another horrifying aspect of the trials. Witch hunters meticulously looked for the witch's mark or devil's mark, any mole, birthmark, unusual skin tag, or even an area insensitive to pain when pricked. The witch's teat, supposedly used to suckle demonic familiars. Naturally occurring bodily features or areas of anesthesia, perhaps resulting from nerve damage or psychological dissociation under extreme stress, were presented as damning proof of a demonic compact, sealing the fate of many innocent individuals. The process of accusation often began with local gossip, personal vendettas, or a community seeking a scapegoat for unexplained misfortunes like crop failures, livestock deaths, or sudden illnesses. Once an accusation was made, the path to conviction was often terrifyingly swift, especially where legal safeguards were minimal. In many regions, spectral evidence was admissible, meaning the accuser's claim to have been harmed by the accused apparition was taken seriously, leaving the defendant with little means of rebuttal. Central to the witch trials was the systematic use of interrogation and torture to extract confessions. Accused individuals, already terrified and often isolated, were subjected to horrific physical and psychological torment. Sleep deprivation, beatings, the thumbscrew, the rack, and water tortures were employed to break their will. Under such duress, anyone, regardless of their innocence or mental state, would eventually confess to whatever their accusers demanded, often implicating others in the process and thus perpetuating the cycle of accusations and trials. The confessions obtained under torture were remarkably uniform in their content, often detailing participation in sabbats, intercourse with demons, the desecration of religious objects, and acts of malevolent magic. This uniformity, however, was less a reflection of any genuine witch cult and more a testament to the leading questions of the interrogators, who effectively fed the narratives to the victims. For an individual already struggling with a fragile grip on reality, the brutal certainty of their torturers could easily overwhelm their own perceptions, leading them to internalize the accusations. Community dynamics played a significant role in the spread of witch panics. Fear is contagious, and once accusations began, mass hysteria could easily take hold. The suggestibility of individuals, particularly children whose testimonies were sometimes used, combined with societal anxieties about sin, the devil, and divine retribution, created fertile ground for witch hunts to escalate rapidly, consuming entire villages or regions in waves of terror and accusation. While it is challenging to retrospectively diagnose individuals from centuries past based on often biased trial records, many scholars who have examined these documents suggest that a significant number of those accused of witchcraft likely suffered from recognizable mental or neurological conditions. Reports of individuals believing they could transform into animals, lycanthropy, experiencing seizures, speaking in tongues, or exhibiting behaviors consistent with dementia, ergot poisoning, which can cause hallucinations and convulsions or various forms of psychosis, frequently appear in the trial accounts, tragically misinterpreted by their contemporaries. Those who were already social outcasts, the elderly, the poor, the reclusive, or those who simply didn't conform to community norms, were particularly vulnerable. Eccentricity, or any behavior deemed strange, could quickly attract suspicion. If an individual was known for muttering to themselves, had a volatile temper, or seemed disconnected from their surroundings, they fit the pre-existing stereotype of what a witch might be like, making them an easy target when the community sought someone to blame for its troubles. The scale of the witch hunts was immense. Over a period of roughly 3 centuries, it is estimated that tens of thousands of people, the vast majority of them women, were formally tried and executed for witchcraft across Europe and in colonial North America. Many more were imprisoned, banished, or died as a result of their persecution. This period stands as a chilling testament to the dangers of mass hysteria, religious extremism, and the catastrophic consequences of misinterpreting human behavior, particularly when it deviates from the norm. The era of the witch trials casts a long, dark shadow, reminding us of a time when misunderstood mental states were not just stigmatized, but actively criminalized and demonized, leading to unimaginable suffering and injustice. It underscores the terrifying power of belief systems to shape reality and dictate the fate of the vulnerable. As we move forward in our history, we will see how the slow dawn of scientific inquiry would eventually begin to challenge these deeply entrenched supernatural explanations for the complexities of the human mind, though the road to enlightenment would be long and arduous. While the terrifying specter of the witch trials dominated the response to many forms of deviant behavior and mental aberration in centuries past, it is crucial to remember that not every individual displaying signs of mental distress was accused of witchcraft or demonic possession. For many, particularly those whose conditions were perhaps less dramatic or whose families had some means or influence, a different, though often still bleak, path unfolded. This involved various forms of confinement and rudimentary care, largely within the precincts of religious institutions or the isolating confines of family homes, where the understanding of their suffering was still deeply entwined with spiritual and moral interpretations rather than medical insight. The simple societal need to manage individuals whose behavior was profoundly disruptive, unpredictable, or who were unable to care for themselves necessitated some form of intervention. This spectrum of madness, as it was broadly termed, encompassed a vast range of conditions, from deep melancholy and incapacitating anxieties to what we might now recognize as severe psychosis or dementia. For those not immediately swept up in the fervor of witch hunts, communities and families still had to find ways to cope with the challenges they presented. In this landscape, monasteries and convents often emerged as de facto places of refuge, or, depending on the circumstances, benevolent prisons for the mentally distressed. These religious institutions possessed the existing infrastructure, a degree of organized labor, and resources that private households often lacked. Furthermore, their perceived spiritual authority made them seem like appropriate places to tend to souls believed to be in turmoil, whether that turmoil was seen as a spiritual affliction, a divine test, or simply an unfortunate state requiring containment. These religious houses thus played a dual role. On one hand, the structured routine, the relative peace within their walls compared to the often chaotic outside world, and the provision of basic necessities like food and shelter might have inadvertently offered a degree of stability and calm that could be beneficial for some individuals. The rhythmic cycle of prayer and work, could provide a framework for existence. However, it's vital to recognize that this was rarely accompanied by any understanding of mental illness as a medical condition. The focus remained overwhelmingly on the spiritual state of the individual, not their psychological or neurological well-being. The prevailing approach could best be described as custodial care. The primary objective was often the safe containment of the individual to prevent them from harming themselves or others, from wandering off, or from causing social disturbance or scandal. The notion of a cure, in the modern medical sense, was largely absent. Instead, the hope was often for a spontaneous remission, perhaps through divine grace, or simply for the individual to live out their days in a managed, controlled environment without posing a significant burden or threat to the wider community. Before or alongside institutional options, the family home was typically the first line of response when a member began to show signs of serious mental distress. This placed an immense emotional, physical, and often financial burden on households. Families had to grapple with behaviors they didn't understand, with the fear and stigma associated with madness, and with the practical difficulties of caring for someone who might be erratic, unresponsive, or even aggressive, all without external support systems or medical guidance. In many cases, if the family could manage it, the afflicted individual might be secluded within the home. This could mean confinement to a specific room, an outbuilding, a cellar, or an attic. The motivations behind such domestic confinement were complex and varied. A desire to protect the individual from the harshness or ridicule of the outside world, an attempt to shield the family from social shame and stigma, a genuine fear of the person's unpredictable behavior, or simply the lack of any viable alternative. This isolation, however well-intentioned, often exacerbated the suffering. The treatments offered in these settings, whether religious institutions or private homes, were overwhelmingly rooted in spiritual beliefs. Prayer was paramount. Prayers by the individual, if they were capable, prayers by clergy or family members on their behalf, the reading of sacred texts, attendance at religious services, if deemed appropriate, and spiritual counseling from a priest or monk formed the core of the therapeutic approach. The underlying assumption was that the soul was sick or under spiritual attack, and that spiritual remedies were therefore the most logical course of action. Beyond purely spiritual interventions, disruptive or socially unacceptable behaviors were often interpreted not as symptoms of an illness but as evidence of a moral failing, perhaps willfulness, inherent vice, stubbornness, or a lack of self-discipline. Consequently, treatment could take the form of disciplinary measures. This might range from stern admonitions and enforced penance to stricter forms of control, reflecting a belief that the individual needed to be morally corrected or broken of their aberrant ways, rather than compassionately supported through an illness. Isolation itself was often considered a form of treatment. It was thought that removing the individual from the temptations, stresses, and stimuli of the world could help to calm their agitated mind or prevent them from negatively influencing others. For those in monasteries or convents, the very structure of monastic life, with its emphasis on solitude and contemplation, was seen as potentially conducive to spiritual healing. However, for many, particularly those confined in less supportive environments, such profound isolation likely deepened their despair and detachment from reality. Harsh physical methods, sometimes lingering vestiges of ancient humoral theories or simply forms of punishment, were also employed, even outside the context of witchcraft accusations. These were not typically aimed at addressing a medical condition in a targeted way, but were often rooted in the idea of shocking the system, expelling bad humors or evil influences, or subduing unruly behavior. Practices such as restraints, chains, shackles, strait waistcoats, dousings with cold water, forced ingestion of bitter herbs, exceptionally bland or restricted diets, and sometimes even bloodletting or purging continued under the guise of treatment, reflecting a fundamental misunderstanding of the body and mind. It cannot be overstated that these methods were applied in an almost complete vacuum of genuine medical understanding regarding the causes of mental distress. The brain was a mystery, and the intricate interplay of biology, chemistry, and experience that we now know contributes to mental health was entirely unknown. The illness, when it wasn't attributed to demons, was perceived as a disorder of the spirit, the soul, or the moral character, demanding spiritual or corrective rather than medical interventions. The quality of life and the nature of care for a confined individual could vary dramatically. Much depended on the specific institution, the wealth and compassion of the family, the attitudes of the individual monks, nuns, or relatives responsible for them, and the perceived nature and severity of their condition. Some might have found a measure of peace and safety. Many others undoubtedly endured neglect, cruelty, and profound loneliness, their suffering compounded by the lack of understanding from those around them. The profound stigma and shame associated with mental distress during these centuries also played a crucial role in the treatment of the afflicted. Families often went to great lengths to hide relatives suffering from mental disorders, fearing social ostracism, damage to their reputation, or accusations of divine disfavor or hereditary taint. This secrecy further isolated the sufferers, cutting them off from any potential community support or even the meager comforts that might have been available, and reinforced the idea that their condition was something to be concealed rather than addressed openly. While the conditions in these early forms of confinement were frequently grim and the treatments misguided and often cruel by modern standards, it is important to distinguish this type of management, however flawed, from the active murderous persecution seen in the witch trials. The intent, at least nominally in many religious or familial settings, might have leaned towards a form of care, spiritual salvation, or at the very least containment for the perceived good of the individual or society, rather than outright extermination. This distinction, however, offered little solace to those who languished in isolation and fear. These early approaches to confinement and care, rooted so deeply in religious dogma and moral judgment, highlight a critical stage in the long and painful journey towards understanding mental illness. While far removed from any concept of therapeutic intervention as we know it, and often characterized by profound suffering, these practices perhaps represented a nascent, albeit deeply flawed, societal attempt to grapple with behaviors and experiences that were profoundly unsettling. They laid a grim foundation upon which the later, equally problematic asylum system would eventually be built, still struggling to reconcile care with control and compassion with fear. As the long medieval period gradually gave way to the Renaissance, beginning in Italy around the 14th century and spreading across Europe, a profound shift in human thought began. This era, aptly named for its rebirth of interest in the art, literature, and philosophy of classical antiquity, also ignited a new spirit of inquiry into the natural world and the human condition itself. While the supernatural still cast a long shadow, the seeds of scientific observation were beginning to find fertile ground. This intellectual awakening spurred remarkable advancements. Artists explored human anatomy with newfound precision, explorers redrew the maps of the world, and thinkers began to question long-held assumptions, venturing beyond the strict confines of purely theological explanations for life's mysteries. This burgeoning curiosity, this desire to understand through direct observation and reason, though initially cautious, started to permeate various fields of study, including medicine. The impact on medical understanding was not immediate or revolutionary, especially concerning the enigmatic realm of the mind, but the currents of change were stirring. Thinkers began to look afresh at ancient medical texts, not just to accept them unquestioningly, but to compare them with observed reality. The intricate workings of the human body, for so long shrouded in mystery and religious proscription, slowly started to become a subject of direct investigation once more. However, it is vital to remember that this was an incremental and often uneven process. The deep-seated belief that mental illness was a consequence of demonic possession, divine retribution, or witchcraft did not simply evaporate with the dawn of the Renaissance. For centuries more, these supernatural explanations would continue to hold powerful sway over popular and even learned imagination, existing alongside and often intermingling with new ideas. A pivotal moment in the journey towards a more empirical understanding of the body came with the work of Andreas Vesalius. In 1543, he published De Humani Corporis Fabrica, on the fabric of the human body. This groundbreaking anatomical atlas, based on Vesalius's own human dissections, dared to correct errors in the centuries-old teachings of Galen, who had relied on animal dissection. Vesalius championed direct observation as the cornerstone of anatomical knowledge. The cautious but increasing practice of human dissection in universities and medical schools, often in public anatomical theaters, provided unprecedented, though still elementary, views of the body's internal structures. Anatomists meticulously charted bones, muscles, and organs. This renewed focus on the physical form was a critical step, even if its direct application to mental disorders remained elusive for a considerable time. The intricate pathways of the mind were not so easily laid bare. Indeed, these early anatomical studies offered little immediate insight into brain function or the underlying causes of mental illness. The brain itself, though its gross anatomy was being mapped, remained largely a black box. Its role in thought, emotion, and behavior was acknowledged, but the mechanisms were entirely speculative, often still framed by ancient philosophical concepts rather than empirical evidence. Rudimentary theories about brain function did circulate. Some involved the ancient idea of ventricles within the brain being the seat of various mental faculties, or the notion of animal spirits, a subtle fluid or vapor flowing through the nerves to control sensation and movement. These concepts, while attempting a physical explanation, were often more philosophical than scientific, bridging the old and the new. One fascinating and complex figure of this transitional period was Paracelsus, a Swiss physician and alchemist of the early 16th century. He boldly rejected some of the established Galenic and Avicenna medical dogmas, emphasizing instead the importance of chemistry and observation. He believed that illness could result from external factors and chemical imbalances. His views on mental illness sometimes hinted at natural, even chemical causes rather than purely demonic ones, though his worldview was still richly infused with alchemical, astrological, and mystical elements. Yet, despite these stirrings of new thought, the old explanations for mental suffering remained deeply entrenched. For the common person, and indeed for many physicians and scholars, the idea that madness was caused by demonic forces, the devil's interference, or as a punishment from God, was still a primary and compelling explanation. The fear of the supernatural was a powerful and persistent force in daily life. The influence of the Church, though its monolithic authority was being challenged in some quarters by the Reformation, continued to be immense. A purely naturalistic or materialistic understanding of severe mental illness was rare, and often viewed with suspicion, potentially bordering on heresy if it seemed to deny the reality of spiritual forces or the immortality of the soul. Interestingly, alongside these enduring supernatural beliefs, the ancient Greek theory of humoralism experienced a significant revival during the Renaissance and early modern period. It became the dominant medical framework for understanding both physical and mental illness among physicians. The idea that health depended on the delicate balance of four bodily fluids, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, was widely accepted. Melancholy, often associated with an excess of black bile, became a particularly prominent diagnosis, almost fashionable in some intellectual and artistic circles. It was considered the disease of scholars and creative individuals. Robert Burton's monumental work, The Anatomy of Melancholy, published in 1621, exhaustively explored this condition from myriad angles, blending medical, philosophical, and religious perspectives, reflecting the era's complex understanding. Treatments based on humoral theory were standard medical practice. These were aimed at restoring the supposed balance of humors and included procedures like bloodletting, lobotomy, to reduce an excess of blood, purging and vomiting to expel excess bile or phlegm, the administration of enemas, and strict dietary regimens. Herbal remedies were also prescribed, chosen for their supposed qualities of heating, cooling, drying, or moistening the body to counteract the humoral imbalance. It's crucial to understand that these different explanatory models, supernatural, humoral, and the nascent anatomical or chemical ideas, often coexisted and were not always seen as mutually exclusive. A physician might diagnose a patient with melancholia due to an excessive black bile, while simultaneously acknowledging that demonic influence could be exacerbating the condition. The lines were often blurred, creating a complex tapestry of belief. As this period progressed, and as physicians and thinkers began to observe and document cases of madness with greater attention, a subtle but important shift began to occur, the first attempts to classify the various forms of mental derangement. This was not driven by an understanding of underlying causes, which remained largely unknown, but by the desire to bring some order to the diverse and bewildering range of symptoms and behaviors observed. These early attempts at nosology, the classification of diseases, were, by modern standards, quite rudimentary. They relied heavily on outward appearances, manifest symptoms, and the perceived severity or nature of the behavioral disturbance. Terms were often vague, and categories overlapped considerably, but the act of trying to differentiate types of madness was itself significant. Felix Plater, a Swiss physician practicing in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, was one notable early classifier. He distinguished conditions based on presenting symptoms, creating categories such as mental alienation, stupidity or imbecility, sleep disorders, and convulsions. His classifications, though simple, represented an effort to move beyond a single, undifferentiated concept of madness. Later in the 17th century, the English physician Thomas Willis made significant contributions to the study of neuroanatomy, coining terms like neurology. He attempted to link specific brain structures to functions and discussed various nervous and mental disorders, including hysteria and hypochondria, often attributing them to malfunctions of the animal spirits or physical issues within the brain and nerves. A step towards a more physiological understanding. Figures like Richard Mead in the early 18th century further pushed for medicalizing madness, arguing that it should be treated as a bodily disease. While their understanding of pathology was limited and treatments remained primitive, often still based on humoral principles or empirical, sometimes harsh interventions, this philosophical shift was important in gradually wresting the concept of mental illness from purely theological or moralistic domains. Common terms used in these early classifications included mania, typically describing a state of frenzied excitement, agitation, and often aggression. Melancholia, as discussed, denoted profound sadness, withdrawal, and despondency. Phrenitis referred to a delirious, frenzied state, often accompanied by fever, likely encompassing various acute organic brain syndromes or infections. Other categories included idiocy or armentia, referring to congenital or developmental intellectual disabilities, and hysteria, a term almost exclusively applied to women, believed to involve a wide array of physical and emotional symptoms attributed, in a holdover from ancient theories, to a disordered womb or, increasingly, to disturbances of the nerves. These early classifications were, of course, fraught with inconsistency and subjectivity. The definitions of these terms varied from one physician to another, and there was considerable overlap between categories. Cultural biases, moral judgments, and prevailing social anxieties heavily influenced how behaviors were interpreted and labeled, often with little empirical basis. Nevertheless, the very act of attempting to classify different types of madness marked a crucial conceptual development. It implicitly suggested that madness was not a monolithic entity, but rather a collection of different conditions, which might, in theory, have different characteristics and perhaps even different, though still largely mysterious, underlying causes. These pioneering, albeit often crude and flawed, efforts at observation and classification during the Renaissance and early modern period laid some of the essential groundwork for the later, more systematic development of psychiatric nosology. They represented the slow, hesitant stirring of scientific inquiry, a gradual turning of the gaze towards the natural world, even in the deeply enigmatic realm of the human mind, inching away from centuries dominated by purely supernatural explanations. As societies grew and urban centers expanded during the later Middle Ages and into the early modern period, the traditional ways of caring for, or simply coping with, individuals experiencing severe mental distress began to prove insufficient. Family care, though always the first line, could be overwhelmed. Monasteries and convents, while offering some refuge, were not designed as dedicated facilities for the ever-increasing numbers of those deemed mad. The problem of madness became more visible, more pressing. In bustling towns and cities, those afflicted, the vagrant, the loud, the melancholy, the profoundly confused, were often a source of public concern, disorder, or fear. The patchwork of existing responses, from local parish charity to familial confinement, was clearly straining under this growing social challenge. There was a rising unspoken demand for a more systematic way to manage these troubled souls. Out of this societal pressure, a new and ultimately notorious type of institution began to emerge: the asylum. The very concept of creating specialized houses or hospitals solely for the purpose of confining individuals considered insane started to take root. This was not initially driven by a desire for healing, but by a more rudimentary impulse to segregate and to impose a semblance of order. This marked a significant transition. While previously those suffering severe mental breakdown might have been hidden away by families, absorbed into monastic communities, or sometimes, tragically, accused of witchcraft, the rise of the asylum signaled a more formal, institutionalized approach. It was a move towards centralizing the problem of madness, though the solutions offered within these new walls would prove to be deeply flawed and often horrific. Perhaps the most infamous of these early institutions, one whose name would become synonymous with chaos and madness itself, was Bedlam Royal Hospital in London, more commonly known as Bedlam. Founded originally as a priory in the 13th century, by the 14th and certainly by the 15th century it had begun to specialize in housing the insane, making it one of Europe's oldest such institutions. Bedlam was not entirely unique, though its notoriety casts a long shadow. Similar establishments began to appear across Europe around this time and in the centuries that followed. For instance, Valencia in Spain established a hospital for the insane in the early 15th century, often cited as one of the first with a more humane founding intent, though ideals rarely matched long-term reality. Other cities in France, Germany, and Italy also saw the development of such places. The motivations behind the founding of these asylums were often a complex mixture. There could be a component of genuine, if misguided, charitable intent, a desire to provide some form of shelter for those who could not care for themselves. However, far more potent drivers were the societal imperatives of control, the urge to remove unsettling or disruptive elements from public view, and to protect the community from perceived dangers. Many of these institutions may have begun with more benign or at least neutral ideas of providing a safe haven. However, the grim realities of underfunding, overcrowding, societal indifference, and a profound lack of medical understanding meant that such initial intentions, if they ever truly existed in a robust form, quickly gave way to conditions of appalling neglect and cruelty. The asylum, in practice, became a place of last resort. The process by which individuals were committed to these early asylums was often terrifyingly arbitrary. There was typically no formal legal proceeding, akin to what we might expect today. A family desperate to unburden themselves of a difficult relative, a parish wishing to deal with a troublesome pauper, or a magistrate seeking to clear the streets, could consign someone to the asylum with minimal, if any, due process. Once behind the asylum walls, the primary purpose became abundantly clear: containment. The overarching goal was custodial, to keep the inmates confined, to manage their behavior, and to prevent them from harming themselves, or, more importantly, from the societal perspective, others. The asylum was, first and foremost, a place to lock away those deemed unfit for ordinary life. The notion of medical treatment in any recognizable modern sense was almost entirely absent. While some larger asylums might have had a physician attached, their visits were often infrequent, and their interventions were based on the still prevailing humoral theories or other speculative, ineffective, and sometimes harmful practices. Curing the madness was rarely the operational focus. Instead, the emphasis was firmly on managing behavior. This translated into a regime of control, often maintained through harsh discipline and physical restraint. The goal was to enforce a degree of order and quiet within the chaotic environment of the asylum, not to understand or alleviate the profound inner turmoil of its inhabitants. Little thought was given to their psychological needs. Economic factors also played a significant role in the nature of these institutions. Some asylums, or sections within them, catered to paying patients whose families could afford the fees, potentially offering slightly better, though still grim, conditions. Many more, however, housed pauper lunatics, whose upkeep was paid for by their local parishes at the lowest possible rates, inevitably leading to severe neglect. Ultimately, the early asylum functioned as a receptacle for society's unwanted. It was a place to deposit those who, for a multitude of reasons related to their mental state, could not conform to social norms, could not work, or whose presence was simply too disturbing for their families or communities to tolerate any longer. They were, in essence, human refuse. The conditions that awaited individuals within these asylums were almost universally dreadful. Overcrowding was rampant. As the numbers of those committed swelled, these institutions became packed far beyond their intended capacity, leading to intense competition for already meager resources and a complete lack of personal space or privacy. This density only amplified the suffering. Sanitation was typically non-existent or horrifyingly inadequate. Inmates were often confined in filthy cells, sometimes with little more than straw on the floor, which quickly became soiled with human waste. The stench was overpowering. Poor ventilation, contaminated water, and insufficient, often spoiled food contributed to the spread of diseases like typhus and dysentery, adding physical illness to mental torment. The use of physical restraints was routine and often brutal. Inmates deemed unruly, disruptive, or simply inconvenient might be chained to walls or beds, sometimes for weeks, months, or even years. Manacles, leg irons, and crude straitwaistcoats were common tools of control, preventing almost any freedom of movement and leading to muscle atrophy and sores. Cruelty and neglect were endemic, staffing levels were generally very low, and those employed as keepers were often ill-paid, ill-trained, and ill-suited to the task. Indifference was common, and outright physical abuse, beatings and whippings, was not infrequent, as a means of punishing or subduing patients. The inmates were largely at the mercy of their often callous caretakers. For those capable of perceiving it, the monotony and isolation were soul-crushing. There were rarely any attempts at providing meaningful activity, occupation, or stimulation. Days would stretch into an endless blur of confinement, often in solitary cells or in bleak, overcrowded day rooms, with nothing to do but sink deeper into despair or psychosis. The auditory environment of an early asylum must have been a nightmare in itself. The cacophony of sounds, the shrieks, moans, incoherent babbling, and desperate cries of hundreds of distressed individuals confined in close quarters would have been relentless, creating an atmosphere of perpetual chaos and terror, further unsettling already fragile minds. Basic physical comforts were almost entirely absent. Cells were often unheated, leaving inmates to suffer intensely during cold weather, with inadequate clothing or bedding to protect them. The food, when provided, was usually meager, monotonous, and of poor quality, contributing to malnutrition and weakening their resilience. The cumulative impact of such an environment on the individuals confined within was devastating. Far from offering any solace or chance of recovery, the asylum experience itself likely exacerbated existing mental conditions, induced new forms of psychological distress, and hastened physical decline. It was a place where hope went to die. One of Bedlam's most notorious features, highlighting the profound lack of understanding and empathy of the era, was its status as a public spectacle. For a small fee, members of the public were permitted to wander through parts of the hospital to gawp at the inmates, much like viewing animals in a menagerie. This show of Bedlam was a popular London attraction for centuries. This practice of turning human suffering into a form of entertainment starkly illustrates the dehumanization of those deemed mad. They were not seen as fellow human beings in need of compassion or care, but as objects of morbid curiosity, figures of ridicule, or terrifying examples of what happened when reason deserted the mind. Their humanity was stripped away. The prevailing societal attitude was one of incomprehension, fear, and a grim fascination. There was no scientific framework for understanding the causes of mental illness. Explanations still often veered towards sin, moral weakness, or lingering suspicions of supernatural interference, even if not outright demonic possession in every case. Empathy was in short supply. The asylum, with its visible population of chained and raving inmates, played a powerful role in shaping and solidifying the popular stereotype of the madman, a figure to be feared, mocked, and ultimately shunned. These institutions became tangible symbols of the terrifying possibilities of mental collapse, reinforcing societal anxieties. While the full flowering of asylum reform would not occur until later centuries, it is important to note that even in these dark times, occasional, faint voices might question the prevailing cruelty. However, for the most part, the early asylum system operated within a societal consensus that saw confinement as the only or best solution, reflecting a profound lack of understanding. The birth of the asylum, therefore, marks a profoundly bleak chapter in the history of mental health care. These institutions, born more of a desire for social control and convenience than for therapeutic intervention, became places of immense suffering and despair. They stand as stark monuments to an era's fear, ignorance, and its failure to provide compassionate care for its most vulnerable members, a grim foundation upon which future efforts would very slowly attempt to build something better. As the 17th century drew to a close and Europe moved into the 18th, the landscape of care for those deemed mad remained overwhelmingly bleak. The early asylums, born more of a need for societal containment than a desire for healing, had largely become synonymous with neglect, squalor, and unimaginable human suffering. Chaining, filth, and public spectacle were the hallmarks of places like Bedlam. Yet, amidst this pervasive darkness, new intellectual currents were stirring. The Enlightenment, that powerful intellectual and cultural movement which championed reason, individualism, and human rights, began to cast its influential light into even the darkest corners of society. Thinkers questioned arbitrary authority, advocated for humane treatment of prisoners, and began to reconsider the very nature of human suffering. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, these ideals started to touch upon the predicament of the mentally ill. A quiet dissatisfaction with the brutal, purely custodial model of asylum care began to grow, albeit among a relatively small circle of reformers, physicians, and philanthropists. The stark image of individuals chained in dungeons, treated worse than animals, started to prick the conscience of some. Was madness truly an incurable state of monstrous otherness? Or could a different approach yield different, more hopeful results? From these nascent questionings and a burgeoning humanitarian spirit, a new philosophy regarding the care of the mentally ill began to emerge towards the end of the 18th century. It came to be known as moral treatment. This was not moral in the sense of strict religious morality, but rather pertained to the psychological, the emotional, and the social well-being of the individual. It was a revolutionary concept that offered a glimmer of hope against a backdrop of centuries of despair. Several key figures are associated with the rise of moral treatment. In France, Philippe Pinel, a physician at the Bicêtre Hospital in Paris and later at the Salpêtrière, became a prominent advocate. In England, William Tuke, a Quaker tea merchant, deeply disturbed by the conditions he witnessed, was instrumental in founding the Retreat at York, an institution that would become an emblem of this new approach. The core principles of moral treatment represented a radical departure from the prevailing norms. at its heart, was a belief in the inherent dignity of every individual, regardless of their mental state. It emphasized kindness, respect, empathy, and sustained humane interaction as essential components of care. The aim was to treat patients as individuals, not as undifferentiated lunatics. Great importance was placed on the therapeutic environment itself. Instead of the chaotic, prison-like squalor of older asylums, proponents of moral treatment advocated for calm, orderly, and aesthetically pleasing surroundings. Cleanliness, fresh air, adequate light, and even gardens were seen as conducive to mental and emotional well-being, helping to soothe agitated minds. A structured daily routine and purposeful occupation were also central tenets. Patients were encouraged to participate in regular activities, including manual labor such as gardening or farm work, crafts, reading, and gentle recreation. The belief was that industry, order, and engagement could help restore a sense of purpose, self-esteem, and connection to reality. Crucially, moral treatment advocated for a significant reduction or even the complete abolition of physical restraints and harsh corporal punishments. Chains, manacles, and whips were to be replaced with patience, gentle persuasion, and the fostering of self-discipline. The idea was to win the patient's trust and cooperation rather than to break their spirit through force. The role of the asylum superintendent and staff was re-envisioned. They were not to be mere jailers, but compassionate guides, mentors, and even parental figures. Personal interaction, understanding, and the establishment of a calm, family-like atmosphere within the institution were considered vital for therapeutic success. Each patient was to receive individual attention. Underpinning these practices was the idea of a re-education of the mind. It was believed that by appealing to the patient's remaining faculties of reason and self-control, by engaging them in rational discourse, and by consistently treating them with respect and kindness, their disordered thoughts and emotions could gradually be brought back into balance. It was a deeply optimistic, person-centered approach. The York Retreat, founded by William Tuke and the Society of Friends in 1796, stands as one of the earliest and most influential examples of moral treatment in practice. It was deliberately designed on a smaller scale with a more domestic, comfortable atmosphere than existing asylums. It emphasized kindness, religious sentiment, Quaker values of peace and respect, and occupational therapy. Contemporaneously, in France, Philippe Pinel's work at the Béquetre Asylum for Men, beginning in 1793 and later at the Salpêtrière Asylum for Women, gained considerable attention. He is famously, though perhaps with some romanticization, credited with unchaining patients, an act that symbolized the shift towards more humane treatment. Pinel stressed careful clinical observation and classification alongside humane management. The earlier reports emerging from institutions like the Retreat and Pinel's reformed wards were often strikingly optimistic. They claimed remarkably high rates of recovery, sometimes suggesting that 70 or even 80% of patients could be cured or significantly improved if treated according to moral principles in a suitable environment. This fueled considerable enthusiasm for the approach. As news of these apparent successes spread, the philosophy of moral treatment began to influence the design and management of asylums in other parts of Europe and, increasingly, in North America during the early 19th century. New institutions were sometimes built with its principles in mind, at least in theory. The architecture of these new or reformed asylums often reflected the ideals of moral treatment. Efforts were made to create buildings that were less overtly prison-like, with more windows to allow for natural light. Individual rooms were possible, day rooms for communal activities, and access to gardens or grounds for exercise and labor. The physical environment was seen as an active part of the therapy. However, it is profoundly important to temper this picture of enlightened reform with a stark dose of reality. While moral treatment represented a significant and laudable philosophical advance, its actual implementation was often limited, and its benefits reached only a relatively small proportion of those suffering from mental illness. The old ways died hard. For the vast majority of individuals confined in asylums during the 18th and even well into the 19th century, conditions remained appalling. Most institutions, particularly large public asylums catering to the poor, were chronically underfunded, overcrowded, and understaffed. The lofty ideals of moral treatment simply could not take root in such barren soil. Economic constraints were a primary limiting factor. Moral treatment, with its emphasis on individualized attention, a higher staff-to-patient ratio, and better facilities, was inherently more expensive to implement than basic custodial warehousing. Public authorities were often unwilling or unable to provide the necessary financial resources on a large scale. As populations grew and societal pressures to institutionalize the mentally ill increased, asylums, including some that had initially aspired to moral treatment principles, frequently became overwhelmed with far more patients than they could adequately care for. Overcrowding inevitably led to a dilution of individualized care and a reversion to more custodial and restrictive practices. Finding and retaining suitable staff also posed a constant challenge. The work was demanding, often unpleasant, and poorly paid. While moral treatment envisioned compassionate and skilled attendants, the reality was often a high turnover of untrained or indifferent staff who found it easier to resort to restraint and coercion than to practice patience and understanding. Moreover, the nuanced philosophy of moral treatment was frequently misunderstood or oversimplified. It was sometimes reduced to a vague notion of being kind, without the essential accompanying structures of therapeutic occupation, a well-ordered environment, and skilled interpersonal engagement. Superficial application yielded few positive results. The principles of moral treatment also seemed to achieve their best results with patients experiencing acute episodes of illness or those who were perhaps less severely or chronically afflicted. For individuals with profound, long-standing conditions, or those perceived as continuously disruptive or dangerous, the promise of recovery through gentle means often seemed elusive, leading to their continued neglect or harsh management. An initial wave of therapeutic optimism generated by the early successes of places like the retreat gradually gave way to disillusionment as it became clear that these high cure rates could not be replicated in the large, under-resourced public asylums that housed the majority of patients. The scale of the problem overwhelmed the idealistic solutions. Moral treatment, for all its humane intent, was an approach to care, not a magical cure for all forms of mental illness. It could not by itself overcome the deep-seated societal stigma, the chronic lack of funding, the complexities of severe mental disorders, or the sheer number of people requiring care. Systemic issues often crippled its effectiveness. Thus, as the 18th century concluded and the 19th century began, the landscape of mental health care was one of sharp contrasts. On one hand, the philosophy of moral treatment had introduced a revolutionary and profoundly humane vision. On the other, the grim reality for most asylum inmates remained one of neglect, harshness, and confinement with little hope. Despite its limitations and the frequent failures in its widespread implementation, moral treatment stands as a critical turning point. It affirmed the humanity of the mentally ill and championed the idea that a compassionate, respectful, and structured environment could be therapeutic. It was a vital reaction against centuries of brutality. The enduring challenge, however, which moral treatment highlighted but could not resolve, was the immense difficulty of providing truly humane and effective care for large numbers of mentally ill individuals within the constraints of limited societal resources and understanding. This gap between ideal and reality would continue to define the struggle for asylum reform. The legacy of moral treatment, though its initial wave eventually waned, was significant. Its emphasis on the patient's environment, the importance of occupation, and the value of dignity and kindness would resurface and echo in later therapeutic approaches throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, reminding future generations that humane care must be the foundation of any response to mental suffering. The Victorian era, spanning much of the 19th century, was a period of dramatic contrasts. It was an age of astounding industrial progress, scientific breakthroughs, and imperial expansion. Yet beneath this veneer of confident advancement lay a society governed by rigid social conventions, strict moral codes, and considerable anxiety about order, propriety, and the perceived fragility of the human mind, particularly the female mind. Mental illness in this Victorian context continued to be a source of profound fear and misunderstanding. While the asylum system had become more established, providing widespread custodial care, the actual treatment and understanding of mental disorders remained rudimentary. This era, however, saw a fervent search for new explanations and therapies, often heavily influenced by the prevailing social biases and scientific paradigms of the time. Nowhere were these biases more apparent than in the medical understanding and treatment of women. The Victorian ideal confined women, especially those of the middle and upper classes, to the domestic sphere, valuing passivity, emotional restraint, and subservience. Deviations from this narrow ideal were often viewed not as expressions of individuality or distress, but as signs of underlying pathology, leading to specific and often misguided diagnoses. Among the most pervasive and telling of these diagnoses was hysteria, though its roots stretched back to ancient Greece and the notion of a wandering womb. Hysteria experienced a dramatic resurgence in the 19th century, becoming an almost ubiquitous label applied, predominantly, to women exhibiting a bewildering array of symptoms. It became the quintessential female malady of the Victorian age. Victorian physicians largely reinterpreted hysteria not as a uterine disorder but as a complex affliction of the nervous system. It was believed that women, being the weaker vessel, possessed a more delicate and susceptible nervous constitution, making them prone to this mysterious condition. The term became a catch-all, a diagnostic net thrown over a vast ocean of female experiences. The range of symptoms attributed to hysteria was astonishingly broad and often frustratingly vague. It could include emotional volatility such as fits of weeping, anxiety, irritability, depression, nervousness, and even anger, expressions that challenge the ideal of placid femininity. It also encompassed physical complaints like fainting spells, insomnia, loss of appetite, shortness of breath, muscular spasms, and even temporary paralysis or sensory disturbance. Crucially, the diagnosis of hysteria often served to pathologize and thus control female emotions and behaviors that did not conform to restrictive societal expectations. A woman who was too intellectual, too assertive, too passionate, or simply too unhappy with her constrained lot in life might find herself labeled hysterical. The diagnosis often reflected societal discomfort with female agency rather than a clear medical condition. Consequently, hysteria appeared to reach almost epidemic proportions during the 19th century, particularly among middle and upper-class women. This was partly due to the vague diagnostic criteria, but also perhaps because these women with more leisure time and fewer outlets for their energies and intellect experienced a unique form of societal pressure and internal conflict that manifested in ways physicians readily labeled as hysterical. Medical explanations for hysteria varied, though they generally centered on the perceived inherent weaknesses of the female sex. Some theories pointed to hereditary predispositions or defects in the nervous system. Others implicated the female reproductive organs, suggesting that menstrual irregularities or uterine problems could trigger hysterical attacks. The stresses of modern life and over-civilization were also sometimes blamed for overstimulating delicate female nerves. Thus, hysteria became deeply intertwined with the Victorian understanding of femininity itself. It was seen almost as an inherent risk of being female, a manifestation of women's supposed emotional instability and physical frailty. This medicalized view reinforced prevailing gender stereotypes and justified the often paternalistic and controlling attitudes towards women's health and behavior. Into this environment stepped Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell, an influential American neurologist practicing in the latter half of the 19th century. He became renowned for developing a specific regimen for treating cases of nervous exhaustion, neurasthenia, and most famously hysteria in women. This treatment came to be known as the rest cure. The rationale behind Mitchell's rest cure was rooted in the prevailing belief that the female nervous system was delicate and easily depleted of its vital energy, particularly by intellectual exertion, emotional distress, or the demands of social life. The cure aimed to conserve and rebuild this supposed nervous force through a radical and highly controlled regimen of enforced rest and bodily nourishment. A core component of the rest cure was extreme isolation. Patients were typically removed from their homes and families, severing all familiar social ties. They were often confined to a private room in a hospital or a specialized nursing home. Correspondence was restricted, visitors were forbidden, and any form of intellectual or creatively stimulating activity, such as reading, writing, or even sustained conversation, was strictly prohibited. This was coupled with prolonged and absolute bed rest. Patients were often confined to their beds for 6 to 8 weeks or even longer. In the most extreme applications of the cure, they were not permitted to sit up, to feed themselves, or even to perform basic personal hygiene tasks without assistance. The aim was to achieve complete physical and mental inactivity, a state of vegetative repose. Alongside rest and isolation, the rest cure emphasized intensive overfeeding, often referred to as fat and blood making. Patients were put on a diet consisting heavily of milk, several pints a day, cream, butter, eggs, red meat, and other rich foods. The goal was to induce significant weight gain, which Mitchell believed was essential for restoring nervous energy and calming the system. To counteract the debilitating effects of such prolonged inactivity and to aid digestion and circulation, passive physical treatments were administered. These typically included daily massage by a trained attendant and, often, the application of mild electrical stimulation to the muscles, phrasization. These measures were intended to maintain some muscle tone and prevent the patient from becoming entirely inert. The physician's authority during the rest cure was absolute and unquestioned. Dr. Weir Mitchell and those who adopted his methods maintained complete control over every detail of the patient's existence: their diet, their activities, or lack thereof, their interactions, and their environment. The patient was expected to surrender her will entirely to the wisdom and direction of her doctor. Proponents of the rest cure argued that it offered significant benefits. For some individuals, particularly those who were genuinely suffering from physical exhaustion, severe malnutrition, or conditions like anorexia nervosa, though not termed as such then, the enforced rest and high-calorie diet might indeed have led to physical improvements and weight restoration, which could in turn alleviate some nervous symptoms. However, for many women subjected to the rest cure, especially those who were intellectually active, creative, or simply frustrated by their limited social roles, the experience was an ordeal. It was often perceived as infantilizing, profoundly boring, and a form of psychological imprisonment. The enforced passivity and lack of mental stimulation could be deeply distressing and counterproductive. The famous short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, written by Charlotte Perkins Gilman in 1892, serves as a powerful literary critique of the rest cure. Gilman herself had undergone a modified version of Mitchell's treatment and found it deeply damaging, later writing that he had nearly driven her to mental ruin. Her story vividly portrays the descent into madness of a woman subjected to enforced rest and intellectual deprivation. Critically, the rest cure, whether intentionally or unintentionally, often served to reinforce the very societal expectations of female passivity and dependence that may have contributed to women's distress in the first place. By systematically removing a woman's agency, controlling her body and mind, and discouraging intellectual pursuits, the treatment effectively tamed unruly or overly expressive women, molding them back into a more socially acceptable, docile form. The perceived success of the cure was frequently measured by the patient's increased compliance, her return to domestic duties without complaint, or her abandonment of intellectual or artistic ambitions that were deemed unfeminine or overstimulating. Genuine psychological healing or empowerment, as we might understand it today, was often a secondary consideration, if considered at all. A stark gender bias was evident in these approaches. While women with nervous disorders were prescribed extreme rest and passivity, men suffering from similar conditions of neurasthenia or nervous exhaustion were often advised to undertake a West cure, a regimen involving vigorous physical activity, travel, adventure, and a change of scenery, designed to build fortitude and masculine vigor. Over time, the rest cure began to face criticism from both patients and other medical professionals. Its paternalistic approach, its questionable efficacy for many conditions, and its often psychologically damaging effects came under scrutiny. Furthermore, the rise of new psychological theories, particularly psychoanalysis in the early 20th century, offered alternative frameworks for understanding and treating hysteria and other nervous disorders, focusing more on internal conflicts and experiences. The Victorian era's obsession with hysteria and its characteristic treatment, the rest cure, offer a fascinating and often unsettling window into the anxieties and assumptions of that society. They reveal much about contemporary views on gender, the limits of female emotional expression, and the use of medical authority to enforce social norms and control. While hysteria as a formal diagnostic category eventually fell out of favor in the 20th century, largely due to its vagueness and its problematic association with female pathology, the underlying issues did not disappear. The tendency to misunderstand or pathologize female emotional experiences, and the debates surrounding the most appropriate and humane treatments for mental distress would continue to evolve. The Victorian experience with hysteria and the rest cure serves as a profound cautionary tale. It underscores how deeply societal biases and cultural norms can permeate medical practice, shaping both diagnoses and treatments. It also highlights the critical importance of listening to and understanding the patient's subjective experience, a lesson that medicine has had to learn and relearn throughout its long and complex history. As the 19th century, with its rigid conventions and often brutal approaches to mental distress, gave way to the dawn of the 20th, a palpable sense of change was in the air. The world was being reshaped by new technologies, scientific discoveries, and evolving social philosophies. Within the realm of understanding the human mind, there was a growing dissatisfaction with the prevailing models of mental illness, the often inhumane asylum system, and the limitations of purely physical explanations like the rest cure. There arose a compelling quest for a deeper, more nuanced understanding of mental suffering. Many physicians and thinkers began to suspect that the visible symptoms of madness, the anxieties, the compulsions, the profound melancholies, and the hysterical conversions, were perhaps merely the surface manifestations of more intricate, hidden processes buried deep within the individual's psyche. A new language was needed to explore this inner world. Supernatural explanations, particularly the idea of demonic possession causing mental illness, had largely faded from mainstream scientific and medical discourse by this point, though they certainly lingered in popular belief. However, the biological explanations that had supplanted them were still in their infancy. Treatments based on these rudimentary physical understandings were often ineffective, merely custodial, or actively harsh, offering little genuine relief to those who suffered. Into this environment of questioning and searching, a revolutionary new way of thinking about the mind began to take shape. This new paradigm would shift the focus dramatically inward, suggesting that the keys to understanding mental disturbance lay not in external spirits, nor solely in the physical matter of the brain, but in the unseen depths of individual psychological experience. This was the dawn of psychoanalysis. At the forefront of this intellectual upheaval was Sigmund Freud, a Viennese neurologist. His early medical career involved the study and treatment of nervous disorders, and he was particularly influenced by his work with hysterical patients. His time spent with Jean-Martin Charcot in Paris, observing the use of hypnosis with hysterics, and his collaboration with Joseph Breuer in Vienna proved to be pivotal. A particularly influential early experience for Freud was Breuer's treatment of a patient known as Anna O. Breuer found that when Anna O was encouraged to talk freely about her symptoms and to recall forgotten traumatic memories and emotions associated with them, her symptoms often improved. This process, which Anna O herself referred to as the talking cure or chimney sweeping, hinted at the therapeutic power of verbal expression and emotional release. From these early clinical observations and extensive self-ascendancy, Freud developed his groundbreaking concept of the unconscious mind. He proposed that a vast and dynamic realm of thoughts, feelings, memories, and drives exists outside of our conscious awareness, yet exerts a powerful influence on our behavior, emotions, and conscious thoughts. This hidden domain was, for Freud, the wellspring of much of our mental life. Central to Freud's theory was the idea of repression. He believed that desires, memories, and thoughts that are too painful, threatening, or socially unacceptable, particularly those of a sexual or aggressive nature, are actively pushed out of consciousness and into the unconscious. However, these repressed elements do not simply disappear. They remain active, seeking expression in disguised forms, such as neurotic symptoms, dreams, or slips of the tongue. Freud also placed unprecedented emphasis on the critical importance of early childhood experiences in shaping an individual's adult personality and their susceptibility to psychological disorders. He argued that the way a child navigates relationships with parents and resolves developmental conflicts during the first few years of life lays down enduring patterns that influence their later mental health. The past for Freud was profoundly present. Dreams, in Freud's view, were not random neural firings, but held significant psychological meaning. He famously described them as the royal road to the unconscious. He believed that dreams provide a disguised outlet for repressed wishes and unconscious conflicts, and that their careful analysis could reveal much about an individual's inner life. Dream interpretation became a cornerstone of his therapeutic method. To explain the structure and dynamics of the psyche, Freud developed a model involving three key components: the id, representing primitive, instinctual drives seeking immediate gratification; the ego, mediating between the demands of the id, the realities of the external world, and the moral dictates of the superego; and the superego, an internalized representation of societal and parental standards, acting as a conscience. He also outlined stages of psychosexual development that he believed all individuals pass through. Psychoanalysis, as developed by Freud, was thus both a comprehensive theory of human personality and psychopathology, and a specific therapeutic technique. The therapy typically involved the patient lying on a couch and engaging in free association, saying whatever came to mind without censorship. The analyst would listen for patterns, interpret unconscious conflicts, analyze dreams, and examine the transference relationship that developed between patient and analyst. The emergence of psychoanalysis marked a decisive shift in understanding many mental health conditions. It offered a compelling, purely psychological alternative to the often inadequate somatic, body-based explanations for neuroses like hysteria, anxiety states, phobias, and obsessional disorders. It suggested that these conditions arose from inner turmoil rather than just faulty nerves or imbalanced humors. While belief in demons or overt supernatural causes for mental illness had already waned considerably within scientific circles, psychoanalysis provided a structured and detailed psychological framework that further marginalized such notions for a wide range of conditions. It also offered an alternative to then prevalent theories of hereditary degeneration, which often carried a heavy stigma and a sense of biological fatalism. Freud's theories firmly located the origin of many mental disturbances within the individual's own psychological history, their internal conflicts, and the workings of their unconscious mind. This was a profound departure from seeing the source of suffering as solely resulting from external spirits, moral failings, or easily identifiable physical diseases of the brain. The mind itself became the primary arena of investigation. In particular, psychoanalysis offered a new lens through which to view the perplexing symptoms of hysteria. Instead of dismissing it as a uniquely female malady rooted in a weak nervous system or a wayward uterus, Freud and his followers interpreted hysterical symptoms, such as paralyses, anesthesias, or fits, as meaningful physical manifestations of repressed emotional trauma, unconscious conflicts, or unfulfilled desires. The impact of psychoanalysis on 20th century thought was indeed revolutionary. Its concepts permeated not only psychiatry and psychology, but also profoundly influenced art, literature, philosophy, and popular culture. It fundamentally changed how Western society perceived the self, motivation, sexuality, the significance of childhood, and the very nature of being human. For many individuals suffering from mental distress, psychoanalysis offered a new kind of hope. It suggested that their suffering was not meaningless or purely a matter of faulty biology, but could be understood and potentially alleviated through the process of talking, gaining insight, and working through unconscious conflicts. This was a stark contrast to the often impersonal and pessimistic asylum regime. However, psychoanalysis was highly controversial from its inception and remains so to this day. Its strong emphasis on infantile sexuality and unconscious aggressive drives was shocking to many in the conservative climate of the early 20th century. Its theories were often seen as speculative, difficult to prove empirically, and the psychoanalytic treatment itself was lengthy, intensive, and expensive, making it inaccessible to most. Furthermore, despite its innovative focus on internal psychological processes, Freudian theory, particularly in its application, sometimes led to new forms of blame or interpretation that could be harmful. For instance, some psychoanalytic ideas, especially as they were developed by later followers, unfortunately contributed to a culture of mother-blaming, where mothers were implicitly or explicitly held responsible for their children's psychological problems based on theories about early maternal influence. Freud's theories regarding female psychology also drew significant criticism then and now. Concepts such as penis envy or the idea that women possessed an underdeveloped superego were widely seen as reflecting the patriarchal biases of Viennese society rather than objective scientific truth. These theories were often accused of pathologizing normal female ambition or dissatisfaction with traditional gender roles, framing them as neurotic conflicts. The dynamic within the psychoanalytic session itself also presented complexities. The psychoanalyst held considerable interpretive authority, and the patient's experiences, memories, and dreams were filtered through the analyst's theoretical framework. If this framework was itself infused with societal biases, or if the analyst was overly dogmatic, interpretations could be imposed in ways that were unhelpful or even damaging. Moreover, Freud's concept of resistance, the idea that patients might unconsciously resist confronting painful unconscious material, could sometimes be used to dismiss a patient's legitimate disagreement with an analyst's interpretation. If a patient rejected an interpretation, it could itself be interpreted as a sign of their resistance, creating a challenging, no-win situation for the patient. It is important to acknowledge that while many specific tenets of classical Freudian psychoanalysis have been revised, challenged, or discarded by subsequent developments in psychology and psychiatry, his core contributions have had an undeniable and enduring legacy. The concepts of the unconscious mind, the lasting impact of early experiences, and the therapeutic value of talking and exploring one's inner world continue to inform many contemporary psychotherapies. Psychoanalysis, therefore, represented a profound paradigm shift. It decisively moved the focus for understanding many mental health conditions away from demons, overt moral failings, and purely somatic explanations towards the intricate and often hidden world of individual psychology. It opened up entirely new avenues for exploring the depths of human experience and suffering. Yet this Freudian revolution was not without its significant caveats. Its application, particularly in its early decades and with regard to women and family dynamics, sometimes resulted in unintended harms, misinterpretations, or the perpetuation of societal biases under a new scientific vocabulary. The path it illuminated was new, but it was still paved with many unanswered questions and evolving understandings. Sigmund Freud's work marked a pivotal, though by no means final, chapter in the long and ongoing human endeavor to comprehend mental illness. It laid crucial groundwork for many of the psychological and psychiatric developments of the 20th century, stimulating both fervent adherence and critical debate, all of which have contributed to the ever-evolving landscape of mental health care today. In 2025, as the early decades of the 20th century unfolded, the landscape of understanding and treating mental illness began to undergo another significant transformation. Psychoanalysis, while profoundly influential in shaping theories of the mind, had not delivered widespread, practical cures for severe mental disorders, particularly for the vast populations languishing in overcrowded and often under-resourced state asylums. A new hope and a new direction began to gain momentum. This period saw the pendulum swing decisively towards what we now call the medical model, a renewed and intensified effort to uncover concrete biological causes for mental illness and to develop physical interventions to treat them. There was a palpable desire for psychiatry to emulate the successes seen in other branches of medicine, which were making strides in conquering infectious diseases and understanding bodily systems. The brain, it was increasingly felt, must yield its secrets to physical science. Rudimentary advancements in medicine, neurology, and surgical techniques, however limited their true understanding of the brain's complexities, fueled an optimism that direct physical treatments could alleviate or even cure profound mental suffering. This quest for tangible solutions, while born of a desire to help, would unfortunately lead to an era of drastic and often devastating interventions, a different kind of misunderstanding and control. This renewed focus on biological psychiatry was not simply a return to older, pre-Freudian ideas. It was an attempt to apply the perceived rigor of modern science to the problem of madness. It framed mental illness not as a spiritual affliction, nor solely as a product of psychological conflict, but as a discernible disease of the brain, an organ that was, in essence, malfunctioning and in need of physical repair. The brain was increasingly conceptualized, albeit simplistically, as a kind of intricate machine. If the machine was broken, then identifying the faulty component or process and directly intervening to fix it seemed a logical approach. This perspective, while mechanistic, offered a tangible alternative to the more abstract and lengthy processes of psychoanalysis, particularly for patients with severe incapacitating conditions. In the earlier part of the 20th century, before the more infamous treatments took hold, theories such as focal sepsis gained temporary traction. This was the idea that hidden, chronic infections in parts of the body, like teeth, tonsils, or even the colon, could release toxins that poisoned the brain and caused insanity. Consequently, many patients endured the surgical removal of these body parts in a desperate and ultimately fruitless attempt to cure their mental ailment. Another avenue of exploration was endocrinology. The role of hormones in influencing mood and behavior was beginning to be recognized, leading to investigations into whether glandular dysfunctions or hormonal imbalances could be primary causes of mental disturbance. While this line of inquiry would eventually yield important insights, early attempts at hormonal therapies were often speculative and ineffective. The pressure for effective and preferably rapid solutions was immense. State mental hospitals were overflowing with patients, many considered chronically ill and incurable. The perceived failures of moral treatment to scale and the inability of psychoanalysis to address the needs of these vast institutionalized populations created a fertile ground for any new treatment that promised tangible results, however radical. Thus, the somatic or physical approach to treating mental illness took firm hold in many psychiatric circles during the first half of the 20th century. The core belief was that direct physical intervention, whether chemical or surgical, targeting the brain or the body's overall physiology, offered the most promising path forward to alleviate the suffering and manage the behavior of the mentally ill. This set the stage for some of history's most controversial medical procedures. One of the first major somatic treatments to gain international prominence was insulin coma therapy, introduced by the Polish-Austrian physician Manfred Sokal in the early 1930s. Sokal claimed high success rates in treating schizophrenia by inducing deep comas through the administration of large doses of insulin. Patients would be brought to the brink of death, then revived. The precise rationale behind insulin coma therapy was vague. Sokal theorized that the physiological shock, the drop in blood sugar, or the induced seizures had a kind of resetting effect on the brain. While some patients did show temporary improvement or become calmer, the treatment was fraught with risks, including prolonged coma, irreversible brain damage, and death. It was a lengthy, labor-intensive, and dangerous procedure. Almost concurrently, Ladislas Meduna, a Hungarian neuropsychiatrist, developed metrazole convulsive therapy, based on the erroneous observation that epilepsy and schizophrenia rarely occurred in the same individual. Meduna hypothesized that inducing seizures might alleviate schizophrenic symptoms. He used the stimulant drug metrazole to trigger these convulsions in patients. Metrazole therapy was a terrifying ordeal for patients. The seizures were violent and uncontrolled, often leading to spinal fractures, broken bones, and extreme fear and anxiety in anticipation of the treatment. While some patients exhibited short-term improvements in mood or behavior, the risks and distressing nature of the procedure soon led to a search for safer alternatives to induce convulsions. This search culminated in the development of electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT, by Italian neurologists Ugo Cerletti and Lucio Bini in 1938. They observed that slaughterhouses used electric shocks to render animals unconscious before slaughter and reasoned that electricity could be a more controlled and potentially safer way to induce therapeutic seizures in humans. In its earliest applications, ECT was a crude and frightening procedure. It was often administered without anesthesia or muscle relaxants, which were not yet standard. The electrical current passed through the brain caused an immediate grand mal seizure with violent muscle contractions that could and often did result in fractures, dislocations, and dental damage. Patients typically had profound amnesia for the event itself, but often experienced intense fear leading up to subsequent treatments. Despite its brutal initial form, ECT quickly became a widely adopted treatment in asylums across the world, particularly for conditions such as severe depression, mania, and catatonia, where it often produced noticeable and sometimes dramatic improvements. For individuals locked in a profound depressive stupor or immobilizing catatonia, ECT could seem like a miraculous intervention, restoring them to a more functional state. However, the exact mechanism by which ECT worked remained unknown for decades and indeed is still not fully understood today in 2025. Significant side effects, particularly persistent memory loss and confusion, were common. Ethical concerns regarding its widespread, sometimes indiscriminate use, and the lack of informed consent began to mount, though it would remain a mainstay treatment for certain severe conditions. Perhaps the most infamous and ethically fraught of all the somatic treatments from this era was psychosurgery, specifically the prefrontal lobotomy. In 1935, the Portuguese neurologist Egas Moniz developed a surgical procedure called a leucotomy, which involved severing nerve fibers connecting the frontal lobes to other parts of the brain. His rationale was that by disrupting these pathways, he could alleviate severe anxiety, agitation, and disturbed thinking. Moniz's work, for which he controversially received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1949, paved the way for the widespread adoption and modification of psychosurgery. In the United States, Dr. Walter Freeman, along with his neurosurgical partner James Watts, further developed and aggressively promoted the procedure. Freeman later developed the transorbital ice pick lobotomy. The transorbital lobotomy was a quicker, simpler, and more brutal procedure that could be performed outside of a traditional operating room. Freeman would insert a long, thin instrument resembling an ice pick through the top of each eye socket, hammering it through the thin bone into the frontal lobes and then manipulating it to sever the nerve fibers. This procedure could be completed in mere minutes. The stated rationale for lobotomy was to calm patients suffering from severe agitation, aggression, intractable depression, or obsessive thoughts, conditions that made them difficult to manage in overcrowded asylums or at home. By surgically altering the brain's emotional circuits, it was hoped to bring about a state of tranquility. Tens of thousands of lobotomies were performed worldwide from the late 1930s through the 1950s. The procedure was often used indiscriminately, not just for severely ill patients, but also for individuals considered merely difficult, rebellious, or nonconformist, including those with conditions like postpartum depression or even just chronic headaches. Many patients and their families were not adequately informed of the risks. The effects of lobotomy were devastating and irreversible. While some patients did become noticeably calmer and less agitated, this often came at the terrible cost of their personality, intellect, and emotional life. Many were left apathetic, emotionally blunted, childlike, and lacking in initiative or judgment. Some became vegetative. The tragic case of Rosemary Kennedy, sister of President John F. Kennedy, who was left incapacitated by a lobotomy, is a well-known example. Lobotomy, in many instances, became less a therapeutic intervention and more a tool of control. a way to render difficult or unmanageable patients docile and easier to care for within the strained resources of the asylum system. It was a means of quieting the unquiet, often by extinguishing the essential spark of the individual. The rise of these drastic physical treatments, insulin coma, metrazole, ECT, and lobotomy, represents a different kind of misunderstanding from the demonic possession or purely moralistic views of earlier eras. Here, the mind and its afflictions were reduced to a problem of faulty wiring or chemical imbalance that could be physically forced back into line, often with little regard for the individual's subjective experience or the profound complexity of the brain. While the intent was often framed as therapeutic, these interventions also constituted a new and profound form of control over the individual's body and mind. Decisions were typically made by physicians and family members, often without the patient's informed consent, and sometimes explicitly against their will. The power dynamic was stark, the patient often voiceless. Each of these treatments was initially hailed by some as a miracle cure offering hope where little had existed. However, this initial enthusiasm often masked a poor understanding of their mechanisms, an underestimation of their severe risks and side effects, and a tendency to apply them far too broadly. The history of these interventions serves as a sobering reminder of medicine's potential for iatrogenic harm caused by treatment itself. The eventual decline in the use of the most brutal of these treatments, particularly lobotomy and unmodified ECT, was due to a combination of factors: growing ethical revulsion, increasing awareness of their devastating side effects, and, crucially, the emergence of the first generation of effective psychotropic medications in the mid-1950s, offered less invasive, though still imperfect alternatives. This era of heroic and often harsh somatic interventions underscores the double-edged sword of the burgeoning medical model in psychiatry. The commitment to understanding mental illness as a biological phenomenon was a vital scientific step. However, the early attempts to translate this into physical cures, undertaken in an era of limited knowledge and immense pressure for results, often led to tragic consequences. The lessons from this period are profound. They highlight the critical importance of rigorous scientific research, ethical oversight, and the principle of informed consent in the development and application of any medical treatment, especially those that intervene directly in the workings of the human brain. The shadows of these harsh treatments remind us of the need for humility in the face of mental illness and the enduring imperative to, first, do no harm. The years following the Second World War, marking the midpoint of the 20th century, ushered in a period of profound societal and scientific transformation. Within the realm of mental health, there was a palpable sense of disillusionment with the massive, often bleak, state asylums and the brutal legacy of drastic, somatic treatments like lobotomies and unmodified electroshock therapy. The time was ripe for a new approach, one that promised hope and a less overtly violent form of intervention. This era witnessed a broader chemical revolution in medicine. The discovery and widespread application of antibiotics like penicillin had demonstrated the power of pharmaceuticals to conquer once devastating physical illnesses. This success fostered a powerful optimism that similar breakthroughs could be achieved for the tormented afflictions of the mind. The search was on for targeted, effective, and less invasive treatments. The desire grew for interventions that could offer relief without the profound risks and ethical quandaries associated with psychosurgery or the terrifying ordeal of convulsive therapies. Scientists and physicians began to explore more intensely the idea that chemical imbalances within the brain might be at the root of mental disorders, and that these imbalances could potentially be corrected with specifically designed medication. The age of psychopharmacology was dawning. This emerging paradigm offered the tantalizing promise of pills that could soothe troubled minds, calm agitated spirits, and perhaps even restore sanity. It was a vision that held immense appeal for patients, their wary families, and a medical profession eager for more effective tools. The focus began to shift from the grand theories of psychoanalysis or the crude mechanics of physical alteration to the subtle chemistry of the brain. A pivotal breakthrough occurred in the early 1950s with the discovery of chlorpromazine, initially synthesized in France as an antihistamine and later investigated for its potential to enhance anesthesia. Its profound calming and antipsychotic effects were soon recognized by psychiatrists. Marketed in North America as Thorazine, it was the first truly effective medication for treating psychosis. The impact of chlorpromazine on the management of severe mental illness, particularly schizophrenia, was nothing short of revolutionary. Patients who had been tormented by hallucinations, crippled by delusions, or lost in agitated, incomprehensible states, often became significantly calmer, more rational, and more responsive to their environment. It did not cure schizophrenia, but it often made the symptoms far more manageable. The advent of chlorpromazine and subsequent antipsychotic medications became a major catalyst for the deinstitutionalization movement. For the first time, it seemed feasible that many individuals with severe mental illness could live in the community rather than spending their entire lives confined within the grim walls of mental hospitals. These drugs appeared to offer a pathway back to a more ordinary existence, at least for some. While antipsychotics were transforming the care of severe psychosis, another class of drugs was emerging to address more common forms of distress. In 1955, meprobamate, marketed under the brand name Miltown, was launched. It was promoted as a tranquilizer, a new type of medication designed to alleviate anxiety, tension, and stress without the heavy sedation of older barbiturates. Miltown became an almost instant sensation, a cultural phenomenon. It heralded the arrival of anxiolytics, drugs specifically aimed at managing everyday anxieties and the pressures of modern life. This was a significant departure from medications used primarily for severe, institutionalized mental illness. Now, it seemed, there was a pill for the worries of the common person. The development of anxiolytics continued rapidly with the introduction of the benzodiazepine class of drugs. Chlordiazepoxide, marketed as Librium, arrived in 1960, followed by diazepam, famously known as Valium, in 1963. These medications were perceived as being even safer and more effective than Miltown, with fewer side effects, and they quickly surpassed it in popularity, becoming household names. The idea that profound mental suffering, or even everyday worries, could be significantly alleviated by simply taking a pill was a paradigm shift. It offered a seemingly straightforward scientific solution to complex human problems. This was profoundly appealing to a society that increasingly looked to medicine and technology for answers and improvements in the quality of life. For many patients and their families, these new psychopharmaceuticals brought genuine relief. Individuals previously crippled by anxiety found they could function more easily. Those experiencing the terrifying symptoms of psychosis found a measure of calm and clarity. The drugs were not perfect, but they often represented a significant improvement in quality of life, at least in the short term. Within the medical and psychiatric community, there was widespread optimism and enthusiasm. Many believed that a new era of effective, scientifically based psychiatric treatment had truly arrived. These miracle drugs seemed to validate the medical model, suggesting that mental illnesses were indeed treatable brain disorders. The availability of these medications dramatically changed the atmosphere within mental hospitals. The need for physical restraints, seclusion rooms, and harsh disciplinary measures often decreased as patients became calmer and more manageable. Antipsychotics, in particular, helped to transform many chaotic and frightening wards into more peaceful, if still often impersonal, environments. This newfound ability to manage symptoms with medication further fueled the deinstitutionalization movement. With patients seemingly stabilized on drugs, the rationale for keeping them in large, expensive, and often dehumanizing state hospitals weakened. The focus shifted towards community-based care, though the development of adequate support structures in the community often lagged far behind the pace of hospital closures. The marketing and prescribing of tranquilizers like Miltown and Valium soon took on a distinct cultural dimension, particularly targeting women. These drugs were often promoted as a solution for housewives experiencing the stresses, anxieties, and dissatisfactions of domestic life in the mid-20th century. They were presented as a way to cope with the pressures of maintaining a perfect home and family. The Rolling Stones' 1966 song, Mother's Little Helper, vividly captured this phenomenon, referring to the little yellow pills that helped a mother get through her demanding and often unfulfilling day. The term became a cultural shorthand for the widespread use of tranquilizers by women seeking to manage the strains of their prescribed social roles. This trend highlighted how societal pressures and personal discontent, especially for women whose opportunities were often limited, could be reframed as medical issues. Instead of addressing the underlying social or personal problems, a pill was offered as a means to adapt and endure. Unhappiness or frustration could be labeled as an anxiety or nerves, treatable with a prescription. The allure of a quick fix was powerful. For individuals feeling overwhelmed by loneliness, boredom, marital difficulties, or the myriad anxieties of life, the prospect of finding relief in a small tablet was immensely tempting. It seemed to offer a simple, private solution to complex emotional states. Sanctioned by medical authority, Statistics from the era often indicated that women were prescribed these psychoactive medications, particularly tranquilizers and sedatives, at significantly higher rates than men. This gendered pattern of prescribing reflected both the societal tendency to pathologize female emotions and the willingness of the medical profession to offer medication as a primary response to women's reported distress. However, as the use of these new pharmaceuticals became increasingly widespread, a range of problems and criticisms began to emerge. Concerns grew about the sheer volume of prescriptions being written for tranquilizers like Valium, which became one of the most prescribed drugs in the world. Were they being used too casually for conditions that might benefit from other interventions? The addictive potential of benzodiazepines and meprobamate also became alarmingly apparent over time. Many individuals who had taken these drugs regularly for extended periods found it incredibly difficult to stop, experiencing severe and distressing withdrawal symptoms such as increased anxiety, insomnia, tremors, and even seizures. Dependency was a serious and often unforeseen consequence. A more fundamental criticism was that these medications, while often effective at reducing or controlling symptoms, did not address the underlying root causes of the mental distress. Critics argued that pills might mask anxiety or suppress psychotic thoughts, but they did little to resolve the psychological conflicts, social inequities, or environmental stressors that might be contributing to the problem in the first place. The first-generation antipsychotic medications, while a breakthrough for treating psychosis, also came with a heavy burden of side effects. These could include significant sedation, weight gain, and distressing motor problems such as tremors, stiffness, and restlessness. Most concerning was the risk of tardive dyskinesia, a potentially irreversible condition characterized by involuntary, repetitive body movements. There were also concerns, particularly within institutional settings, but also in the community, that these medications could be used as a form of chemical straitjacket. Instead of genuinely improving a patient's well-being or fostering their recovery, drugs might sometimes be employed primarily to control behavior, to make individuals more compliant and easier to manage, thus prioritizing institutional convenience over individual needs. The pharmaceutical era highlighted both the promise and the limitations of a purely medical or biological model of mental illness. It became clear that while medications could be invaluable tools, they were not a panacea. Mental health was far more complex than just a matter of brain chemistry. Psychological, social, and personal factors remained profoundly important. The introduction of psychopharmaceuticals in the mid-20th century was undeniably a double-edged sword. These drugs brought profound relief from suffering for many and offered alternatives to the brutal treatments of the past. They transformed psychiatric practice and made community living a possibility for individuals who would previously have faced lifelong institutionalization. Yet this revolution also brought new challenges, issues of dependency, side effects, overprescription, and the risk of neglecting the broader psychosocial needs of individuals. The ongoing search for balance, integrating pharmacological treatments with psychological therapies, robust social support, and a holistic, nuanced understanding of mental health, became the central task for psychiatry, a conversation that continues with vigor and evolving insights to this very day, here in 2025. And so, our long journey through the often shadowed corridors of how humanity has perceived mental illness draws to a close. We have traversed centuries of belief, from ancient whispers of malevolent spirits to the complex scientific inquiries of our modern age, witnessing a profound and often painful evolution in understanding. For so much of recorded history, as we've seen, the experience of mental distress was inextricably linked with the supernatural. The troubled mind was a battleground for demons, a sign of divine displeasure, or the cursed outcome of witchcraft. This lens of fear and superstition shaped not only belief, but also the often cruel and isolating responses to those who suffered. When the immediate shadow of the demonic began to recede in some explanations, it was often replaced by a framework of moral failing or inherent defect. Madness could be seen as a weakness of character, a deserved affliction, leading to judgments and treatments that aimed more at correction or confinement than at compassion or healing, further deepening the isolation of those affected. The slow dawn of medical inquiry brought with it the hope of understanding mental illness as a condition of the body, particularly the brain. Yet this path, too, was fraught with peril. Early physical interventions, from harsh somatic therapies to misguided surgeries like lobotomies, often stemmed from a desperate desire for cures but resulted in new forms of suffering, born of incomplete knowledge. The turn towards the psychological, particularly with figures like Freud, opened up the inner world as a source of both distress and potential healing. This was a crucial shift, acknowledging the importance of personal history and unconscious processes. Yet even these new theories sometimes carried their own biases and limitations, particularly in how they interpreted the experiences of women and children. Then came the pharmaceutical era of the mid-20th century, offering powerful new tools to manage symptoms. Medications brought relief to many and were a vast improvement over the brutal treatments of the past. However, they also introduced complexities of dependency, side effects, and the risk of masking deeper issues rather than fostering comprehensive recovery. Now, this long history teaches us anything, it is the profound human cost of misunderstanding and fear. Centuries of stigma, mistreatment, and lost potential have been the tragic consequence of viewing mental illness through lenses of supernatural evil, moral judgment, or overly simplistic biological reductionism. The echoes of these past misunderstandings still subtly influence us. The importance of compassion, of truly listening to the experiences of those who live with mental health challenges, cannot be overstated. Recognizing the historical context of their suffering and our own evolving understanding allows us to approach the present with greater empathy and a commitment to validating each individual's unique journey towards well-being. Here in 2025, our understanding is more nuanced, embracing a biopsychosocial perspective that acknowledges the intricate interplay of genetics, brain chemistry, life experiences, trauma, and social determinants. We have journeyed far from the belief in demons, yet the brain and mind still hold many mysteries, and our knowledge is constantly evolving. The road ahead still requires our unwavering commitment. While progress has been immense, challenges of stigma, equitable access to care, and the need for continued research remain. Our shared history reminds us that the pursuit of understanding, kindness, and effective support for all those affected by mental illness is an ongoing and most vital human endeavor. May we continue to learn from the past, to illuminate the present, and to build a more compassionate future.